Hello and welcome everybody. And today we're talking to Professor Neil Mercer, who leads the Oracy Centre at Hughes Hall, University of Cambridge, and he'll be telling us a little bit about his work with educational dialogue. So, could you please start off by telling us a little bit about the decades of work that you've done in the field of dialogic education and Oracy education as well?
Yeah, well, I really studied dialogue, that is talking classrooms, for most of my research career. It really began when I had a project with Derek Edwards and Janet Mabin at the Open University, um, which was looking at talking classrooms and became the book Common Knowledge. And we really began it because we could see that talk is really the way that education, it's the main tool of a teacher's trade, and classroom education really depends on the effective use of talk, and yet it hadn't been studied an awful lot. There were some people like Douglas Barnes who did great things, and we were very influenced by. But there was a lot to find out, we thought. So that's when it began, and that was back in the 1970s.
Right. Okay, and I remember reading Common Knowledge, and it's a really fascinating book. And one of the things that struck me in there is this idea of interthinking. So could you explain a little bit about that idea?
Yeah, this is actually a word that Lynn Dawes, who's a people will probably know does a lot of work in this area too, and happens to be my wife. We came up with this word together, and I think that explains it in a funny way. Um, what we really were trying to say that is, if you use language effectively when you're working with someone, you don't just interact, you interthink. That is, you think collectively. And language really is recognised, I think, more generally now as something that's evolved to enable humans to be to think collectively in order to create a sort of mega brain by getting together in a way other animals can't, and that it's really part of our essentially social intelligence. And we thought there wasn't really a word for it, and I say it's relevant to say how we thought of it, because neither of us is really sure who thought of it first. And that's the whole point about interthinking, is you often can't attribute ideas to an individual. It's the product, the two minds are better than one kind of idea.
Okay, and I think from what I understand, there's some neuroscientific evidence for this as well now. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think when you look back at when Steven Pinker and people like that were writing initially about language and thinking, um, it was almost like the idea that like language was a sort of app stuck on the brain, almost separate thing, very influenced by Chomsky's linguistics. This idea we have a sort of language acquisition device, and something that really operates a bit separately from the mainstream intelligence of a human being. And I think we now know they're much more integrated. Work by people like Usha Goswami at Cambridge in neuroscience has shown the essential integration of language into the function of the human brain, and hence it's part of it's essentially part of our intelligence, really. I think the fact we can use it to think in this way.
Okay, great. So what we're trying to do with this course is enable these kinds of ideas to become operationalized in classrooms, and you've done some work around that. So this idea that you have of exploratory talk, could you explain a little bit more about that? Is that how can we as educators identify exploratory talk in our classrooms to help children to learn how to interthink and therefore to help them develop their thinking skills?
Yeah, exploratory talk was actually a term that Douglas Barnes thought up. He contrasted it with presentational talk, which is when you're doing something more like what I'm doing now, which is where you're presenting some ideas that you've probably worked out in advance. And he was trying to show that although that's something that's demanded of children in school and of adults, an equally important kind of talk is when you're just thinking out ideas and you're thinking on your feet. And we kind of developed that idea a bit to look at the way it could be used to describe the most productive kinds of discussions. And that's really what exploratory talk is. It's a representation of the most productive kinds of discussions, not just in classrooms and groups of children, but almost anywhere really,
Right.
when people are trying to solve a problem or get something done by using talk.
Yeah, so I mean, teachers are often really pressured now to try and get a certain amount of content across to make sure that children have understood certain things. But could you maybe just explain a little bit about how, exploratory talk might actually help students to learn in a different kind of way, or a better kind of way? Could you give a little bit of outline of
Yeah, yeah. Well, if you focus on group work in school, there's some really interesting research findings on group work. One lot of findings, um, for example, those by Maurice Galtman people from some years ago, show that group work can often really not be very effective as a way of spending students' time in the classroom. Uh, you can put children together and students of any age, and they just won't necessarily get anything productive done because they're falling out with each other or not listening or somebody's talking all the time. And this has put a lot of teachers off it. You'll hear people like Tom Bennett and people who are very visible on the Twitter sphere saying that group work is no point teachers doing it. But the other kind of research, of which a good example is that by Christine Howe from Cambridge, is that if students know how to talk well together and have a good discussion, it's brilliant for learning. And they get to understand, she found that they get to understand maths and science better if they're working together, as long as they know how. And so what we really drew the implication was that many people, and I have to say, not even all adults, know how to have a good discussion. And even if they sort of half know how, they don't do it. So what exploratory talk is, and the idea of teaching students to do it, is to get them to realise, raise their awareness of what a good discussion is, and then getting them to follow some sort of rules to carry it out. And when they do, we found, back from the research that Rupert Wegerif and Lynn Dawes and I did some years ago, you find the students themselves start to realise that this is great and we're getting somewhere with it, and they can become self-regulating, as it's now known, and they can run good discussions themselves, and they achieve better outcomes. Christine Howe found that individuals then get better results in science and maths because they've thought it through in this way, and the discussion becomes kind of internalized as a reasoned way of making sense of what they're trying to learn. So both things are true, that group work can be a terrible waste of time, and it can also be wonderful for learning. It all depends on students being taught how to do it, because you can't assume they know how.
Okay, great. So just finally, could you just outline very quickly how ground rules would help generate exploratory talk in a classroom setting?
Yeah, well, in exploratory talk, it's the essence of it really is that these things really, that everybody participates, everybody shares relevant information, people engage critically with each other's ideas. So you don't just say yeah, yeah to everything, but you do it in a constructive and respectful way. You give reasons for that, for why you're putting a point of view, why you're disagreeing. And if you don't understand someone, you ask a question. You don't just wonder. And what's more, people then build on each other's responses. They don't just start again, or they actually get somewhere by constructing knowledge together. And in the end, they strive for agreement. That's a crucial aspect that Christine, for example, found in her research. You want them to try and strive for agreement if they're going to consolidate what they learn. So what we did was we realized what you could do is change those into a set of rules, if you like, of ground rules. And we use this term ground rules because it's a term that was taken up from sport, and it means the kind of unspoken rules that operate. So everybody who's having a good discussion is following rules that say things like, we will all actively participate, we will share relevant information, we will engage critically but constructively with each other's ideas, and I'll give a reason for my views. So everybody's following these rules, but they're never written down. They're not typically written down. So what we said, write them down, make them explicit, and then get students to follow them. And we think from our own experience and our own experience as speakers, that they'll appreciate that it's better doing it that way than not. And so what we did was then, suggest this as a process that teachers can carry out in the classroom. and it doesn't take very long. And it can, and if there's one thing that can transform, there's a few things, but one of the things that's most important if you want to transform the quality of group work in a classroom is to get students to agree to a set of ground rules for exploratory talk.
Hey, that sounds an amazing way of distilling, all these years of research into something that's very tangible that teachers can actually use in the classroom. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we've managed to cover most of the core concepts that have emerged out of your work that teachers can sort of employ in the classroom. So thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Farah. Thank you.